Thanks, Bruce. I'm back here right now backstage. I'll be interviewing the fighters as they come out of the octagon, and I'll also be previewing. The only thing that I had going for me was that I was crazy and that I had been spending most of my high school years fighting.
And that was you?
Yeah,
with the walk-off?
That was me with the walk-off.
I have Mr. Joe Rogan. Give him a hand.
Life's going pretty cool right now, but I gotta stop dating bimbos. It's like the biggest problem I have in my life right now. So I date too many bimbos. But bimbos are good to date every now and then because they're low maintenance, right?
I got talked into doing stand-up by my friends from martial arts. For real. Girl was guarding the front door by herself. What are you trying to say? That women can't do everything men can do? Exactly. That's exactly what I'm saying. You know, when you start out doing a podcast, well, I only got 10 downloads. Well, that's how it works.
We all were there once.
Yeah, I was there once. Dude, when we first did it, when Brian and I were first doing this podcast and we were doing it on like Ustream, we would have 200 viewers.
If I were to ask you how much you thought the Joe Rogan Experience earns per year from ad revenue and sponsorships, what kind of number might you throw out there as a ballpark figure? 500,000, 1 million, 2, 3, 5 million, I mean even 10 million? Well, none of these numbers are even close. Try an estimated $30 to $50 million in 2019 alone. On top of this, I'm sure many of you have heard about Joe Rogan's switch from YouTube to Spotify in September 2020, a deal worth an estimated $100 million according to the Wall Street Journal. But how could Joe Rogan possibly get to this point? How could Joe Rogan possibly go from an average guy working a drudgerous construction job,
And then I had to be up at 7 to go to my construction job.
to the most powerful interviewer who has ever lived?
Okay, so you're getting 1 billion downloads a year.
Something like that.
So I could ask you, what do you make of that? Like, are you the most powerful interviewer on the planet, or are you the most powerful interviewer that the planet has ever seen?
Whoa.
Because who has 1 billion of anything? No one.
It's safe to say that over his experience, shall we say, Joe Rogan has certainly picked up a few irreplaceable tricks along the way.
I mean, who else is a UFC fighter and a commentator and a podcaster and a comedian and, interested in all these things and knows all these people? Can't replace you.
Ladies and gentlemen, join me as we cover the story of Joe Rogan and the Joe Rogan Experience. Our story begins in Boston, early 1980s. The name Joe Rogan is far from famous at this point in time. In fact, Joe Rogan is simply a 16-year-old high school kid full of potential and ready to take on the world. His stepfather, an architect in the area, had the ability to provide Joe with some construction work given his position at the time.
When I was a kid, my dad was an architect, and so I worked on a lot of construction sites.
However, after working in construction for a period of time, Joe decided that he didn't really enjoy the work and decided that a normal job just wasn't really for him.
I didn't feel like I had I knew one thing: I couldn't work like a regular job. Like, I had to figure out something else, because there's the idea of, it was literally the idea of being in an office was like torture.
At the same time, Joe had already been training in various different martial arts and was initially considering martial arts as a career alternative to the construction jobs that he was working at the time.
I could not exist in a regular job. I didn't have it, whatever it was.
Yeah, it's a thing. When you know you don't have it, it's kind of scary. Like, oh no, I'm not going to have a straight life.
Joe had been doing martial arts since the age of 14. He began with karate and wrestling as a result of an altercation with another peer in school.
One of the reasons why I got into wrestling, this kid, we had this confrontation in a locker room, but I do remember him getting me in a headlock, throwing me on the ground, and then leaning like he was gonna punch me in the face, but deciding not to. And I didn't know what to do.
At the age of 19, after training for 5 years, Joe Rogan entered the US Open Championship Taekwondo tournament as a lightweight, of which he was the winner.
That was a Taekwondo tournament. I was 19 then.
And then following this, Joe became the Massachusetts full contact state champion for 4 consecutive years.
I won the Massachusetts State Championship 4 years in a row.
Also becoming a Taekwondo instructor given his skill level. However, Joe didn't really know if this is what he wanted to do over the long run. Joe began to lose faith in Taekwondo, so he began to dabble in boxing and kickboxing as a better long-term alternative.
That's when I was starting to box and kickbox, and I was losing faith in Taekwondo. I was realizing that there was I had a distorted perception of what I could do.
However, after only 3 amateur kickboxing matches, Joe decided to stop kickboxing, stating firstly that he had a distorted view of what he could achieve following his Taekwondo success, and secondly that he feared being hit in the head, potentially causing a permanent injury. Joe Rogan was once again without a clear path of what he wanted to do with himself.
Bimbos are good to date every now and then because they're low maintenance, right? If you date smart women, they ask tough questions, you gotta give them real answers, right? Date bimbos, they ask like real easy questions, you can tell them anything, right? They're like, what are you thinking about? Corn.
Age 21 also happened to be the same year where Joe Rogan began to pursue a new gig that would eventually go on to become his main pathway.
Remember when you were a kid, you thought, well, you know what, everything's gonna be good someday. Everything will be better. It's not getting better. Nothing gets better. You know why? Because dumb people are outbreeding smart people 20 to 1.
Joe stated that when he and his martial arts buddies would go to various different tournaments, he would make jokes and say stupid things to try and cut the pre-fight tension.
We would go to compete, or we would be about to spar, and I would be the guy who would make everybody laugh. Because everybody was so nervous, because it was scary.
The guys he did martial arts with then convinced him to try stand-up comedy, assuming he'd be good at it given his comedic personality. So on the 27th of August 1988, Joe Rogan went on stage to perform his first comedy set.
Oh, I was so
Where
terrified. It was in Boston, at a place called Stitches.
Are they still there?
August 27, 1988. No, they're not still there.
You know the date?
Yeah, for sure.
You're gonna make me cry. That's awesome. Why do you remember that?
I don't know. I always remembered it.
Joe recalls the jokes being so awful that barely anybody laughed in his whole 4-minute first set. A humbling reality check reminding us that sometimes you have to look like an idiot before you can master a skill. However, that initial embarrassment was not enough to stop him. Joe realized that he loved comedy so much that he came to a bit of a crossroads. He was still doing martial arts at the time, but was really enjoying comedy too.
And so when I was getting into, really into kickboxing was 20 into 21. And at the same time, I was thinking about doing stand-up. Because I was already doing comedy at the time, and I was starting to realize, I gotta pick one or the other.
Yeah. He had to pick one or the other. And since comedy seemed to have better long-term prospects, Joe decided that doing comedy was his best option. By 1990, 2 years after beginning comedy, Joe Rogan was officially a full-time comedian in New York City. Joe's comedy style was mainly blue comedy, a comedy style involving usually indecent and profane references, landing him multiple gigs at bachelor parties and even strip clubs. After 6 years of comedy between 1988 and 1994, Joe Rogan relocated to Los Angeles, which is where things really started to pick up in his work life. And after 6 years of perfecting his craft, Joe was extremely skilled at comedy, which landed him his first role on national television with a show on MTV called Half Hour Comedy Hour.
What's up? What's going on, huh?
He then used this experience on television to land an acting role in his first ever TV show titled Hardball.
It was about a baseball team, a f***ed up baseball team. And I was the guy who was always causing trouble and wrecking his car and going crazy. That was me. I looked like a baby. It's so weird.
Joe then once again used that experience to land a role in a more notable TV show, News Radio, appearing in 96 out of 97 episodes before the show was eventually cancelled in 1999.
Have you seen any good movies lately?
Me, I don't go to movies. I don't like movies. Most movies suck. Someone says, hey Joe, you want to go to a movie? You know what I say? Say, I don't like movies. I don't go to movies. Most movies suck.
And then on top of all of this, Joe also became a regular at the Comedy Store in LA in 1997, an experience that he's discussed extensively since. So it's safe to say that Joe Rogan well and truly had his hands filled by this point. We don't really think of Joe Rogan as an actor, but that's what his main gig was at this point, acting and comedy. But Joe explained that he didn't want to be an actor forever. He simply saw acting as a way to pay the bills while working on his true creative passion, comedy. However, by the late 90s, an issue started to arise for Joe Rogan. The acting was drying up a bit, resulting in a need for an alternative endeavor to cover the bills.
You know what boxing is? Well, boxing is a very limited form of fighting. It's kind of a silly agreement. Say, we hate each other, we're going to fight, we're going to duke it out man to man, but we're only going to use our hands. That's it. What ultimate fighting is, it's the actual sport of fighting. It encompasses all aspects of fighting.
At the same time that the acting gigs were starting to dry up, Joe Rogan began to get more interested in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, a fighting style that was being being popularized by Royce Gracie, who was a fighter on the relatively new Ultimate Fighting Championship, or UFC for short.
8 of the deadliest fighters in the world will meet in a no-holds-barred combat to determine who is the Ultimate Fighting Champion.
Joe's manager at the time, Jeff Sussman, knew the organizer for the UFC, which provided the opportunity for Joe Rogan to become a post-fight interviewer.
I got a call from my manager, and it was essentially saying, all right, there's this thing that we got an offer for. I'm sure you're not going to want to do this, but...
Joe accepted the offer, which was followed by Joe Rogan's first appearance on the UFC in February 1997.
Let's go up to Joe Rogan. Joe?
I'm here live with Victor. Congratulations, Victor. Unbelievable victory.
However, after only 2 years, Joe Rogan quit, stating that he just wanted to watch people fight and drink. Also mentioning that it didn't pay enough comparative to what he could be earning while doing comedy.
I actually had to quit because it was costing me money. Because like if I would go to do a UFC, I don't remember how much I made. It wasn't that much to do the interview stuff. But then if I could do a comedy gig, I could make like $2,000 for a weekend.
Right.
So I was like, why am I doing that when I can make $2,000? Like, what am I doing? I'm making like 1 instead of 2. So it was just costing me money.
However, Joe then got back into doing the commentating after the UFC president offered him and his buddies free Prime event tickets in exchange for the work. After commentating on 15 different matches for free, Joe accepted pay for the job and was officially a UFC commentator again.
It's a much more exciting sport than any of the other combat sports that are out there right now. And that's why it's here, and that's why it's the fastest growing sport in the world.
A role that he would continue into the early 2000s, at which point Joe decided to pick up another acting job that would boost his notoriety tremendously.
Thanks for coming out! Fear Factor has been known for dreaming up some of the most outrageous and insane stunts you could possibly imagine.
Joe Rogan then began hosting the show Fear Factor in 2001, an absolutely preposterous show that would force contestants to face severe challenges in exchange for cash prizes.
It was a preposterous show, like from the jump, and I always thought it was going to be canceled, and it was a giant hit. It was a giant hit.
Huge show.
And like immediately it was a hit. I was like, this is so stupid. The show is so stupid. And
Joe originally explained that he got the main role in the show because he treated the show like a joke, thinking that all he could possibly get out of it would be new material for his jokes.
This is the most insane idea for a television show I've ever heard. This is going to be canceled immediately, and I'm going to have all this material about, remember when I used to host Fear Factor?
The show featured all sorts of different challenges, such as eating different insects, crazy car stunts, and even the challenge of fighting Joe Rogan himself.
He got in Joe's face.
And then he got too close to Joe.
Please. Oh my God.
And then all of a sudden they start going at it.
And they had told me about him before he did the show. They're like, this guy's a serious hothead. We were thinking about not having him on the show at all, but we thought it'd be good drama, but be careful.
However, in the second last season around late 2004, Joe was getting pretty tired of making the show, stating that the repetitiveness of the show was starting to get monotonous.
When I was on like season 5 of Fear Factor, I remember thinking, I don't know how much longer I can do this.
What was it about it that it was just too much, repetitive?
It was the same thing over and over again. We did 148 episodes.
Right.
The show was then cancelled only 1 season later in 2006 due to a highly inappropriate stunt performed in one of the episodes. But this wasn't such a bad thing for Joe. He had starred in 148 episodes, boosting his notoriety tremendously, and he had no liability to continue making the show, giving him more time to invest in his comedy sets. On top of this, it gave Joe enough money to never have to worry about finances ever again, a factor that would go on to help him in his later endeavors.
It gave me the ability to not worry about like having money in the bank. Because I don't have like extravagant tastes. I'm not too ridiculous with money, but I like feeling like I don't have to worry. Like as soon as you don't have to worry about, okay, good, don't think about that anymore. Now think about other things. So it really helped me there.
And since he was now so famous from Fear Factor, the turnout to his comedy shows was significantly increased comparative to the early days. On top of all of this, Joe stated that focusing on television made him feel lazy and uninspired to write new material for his comedy acts. For this reason, from 2005 to 2009, Joe retired from acting to diligently focus on producing comedy while continuing UFC commentary as a side gig. Joe also hired 2 full-time cameramen with the money he had earned from from Fear Factor, ultimately resulting in various different comedy specials and random multimedia endeavors between 2005 and 2009.
The devil made me do it, ladies and gentlemen. I apologize for my evil. The devil's a dirty white comedian from New Jersey.
However, it was in 2009 when Joe Rogan would begin a new endeavor that would propel his name into absolute stardom, essentially turning the name Joe Rogan from that UFC commentator and comedian to essentially a household name.
We are broadcasting live. This is my office. This is Brian Reichel, aka Red Band. Hello, world.
December 24th, 2009, Christmas Eve. The very first episode of the Joe Rogan podcast live stream type thing begins on the website Ustream. The podcast began because Joe was forced to move with his wife from Colorado back to LA, a move that he didn't want to make considering he felt as though he had finally escaped the madness of Hollywood life.
We had to move from Colorado back to LA, and I was bummed out. I was like, I thought I escaped. I thought I got out of LA. I was living in the mountains. I was like, this is what I want. I want to be in nature. I was like, I don't want to be back in this fucking hellhole. Like, all right, let's do something. And so we started doing podcasts.
The very first episode of the show was promoted on JoeRogan.net, giving it enough exposure to gain 200 concurrent viewers on the first stream.
When Brian and I were first doing this podcast, and we were doing it on like Ustream, we would have 200 viewers.
Brian Redband, the first guest on the show, had been producing comedy and film content with Joe dating back to 2003. The idea for the podcast was that it would be a lot like the previously produced multimedia, but live to an internet audience where they could gauge the reactions via chat and Twitter. The initial idea was also that it would be exclusively Brian Redband and Joe Rogan talking about various topics. But after only 2 episodes, they realized that there's only so much they can talk about and decided to bring in comedian Ari Shaffir as the first ever guest on episode 3. From this point, Joe decided that the goal of the podcast was to talk to people that he simply liked talking to.
I try to talk to people like yourself that I really enjoy talking to.
And since most of his friends at the time were actors, comedians, and individuals from the martial arts scene, the first guests on the podcast were people like Eddie Bravo.
People been calling for young Eddie Bravo to be on the Joe Rogan podcast. He's here, ladies and gentlemen. There he is, Eddie Bravo.
Joey Diaz.
Joe Diaz in the motherfucking house.
That's
one of the funniest human beings I've ever met in my life. I've known Joey for about a decade.
And Duncan Trussell.
I'm here with Duncan Trussell, ladies and gentlemen. Duncan Trussell has joined the podcast.
As the podcast began to gain more and more traction, Joe realized that the show needed a more official name. For the first 8 months of the podcast, the show didn't have a name. It was just the Joe Rogan Podcast. However, in August 2010, the podcast was officially named the Joe Rogan Experience, which was a tribute to the Jimi Hendrix Experience, which explains the Jimi Hendrix studio mugshots in the background of many of the episodes.
But the actual image is from it's one of the Jimi Hendrix Experience, which is where I stole the name for this podcast.
At the same point, the podcast really started to blow up in popularity. Joe realized that the growth of the podcast invited the opportunity to have more notable guests on the show, resulting in the appearance of individuals like Tim Ferriss.
Tim Ferriss is here, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And Sam Harris.
Sam Harris, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for joining me, man. This is really cool.
Proving that the podcast worked with more than just comedians, actors, and fighters. The growth of the podcast then became even stronger, so much so that by around episode 300 in January 2013, Joe Rogan created the PowerfulJRE YouTube channel with the intention of reaching a wider audience. At this point, there were very few other YouTube channels doing long-form podcasts on YouTube, so to post such lengthy videos on YouTube almost seemed bizarre to the audience. However, Joe did it regardless, considering it was free. As soon as the YouTube channel was created, it began to explode, gaining 100,000 subscribers in the first year and 150,000 in the second year, totaling 250,000 by early 2015. And as the channel grew, so did the notoriety of the guests. Neil deGrasse Tyson, Vsauce, Kid Cudi, Joe Rogan was beginning to establish himself as a guy who could get famous individuals on the show that the audience wanted to listen to. And the trade-off was pretty simple, really. The notable or famous individual would spend a few hours of their time, Joe got his episode, and the individual got free exposure. The podcast then began to be seen as a revolutionary way for people to find out information on someone they might admire, as well as the ability to just observe whoever they might truly be in the most authentic possible conversation. Previously, the only real way that you could find out info on these celebrities were edited interviews or high-pressure paparazzi situations. The podcast really deconstructed that and promoted celebrities being who they really were without their fame, just regular people. For this reason, Joe went from interviewing comedians, actors, and fighters to high-profile scientists, Hollywood movie stars, and billionaires in a matter of a few short years. The Joe Rogan Experience grew so much that it was moved from his home in LA to the now private studio in Huntington Hills, Los Angeles. The studio that we now see with a notorious brick wall and red curtain backdrop.
Jamie, do you love that TV? Are you in love with it?
This much.
Then in mid-2017, when the Joe Rogan Experience was at 1.5 million subscribers, the podcast hit 1,000 episodes.
We're live, ladies and gentlemen. 1,000 episodes.
At which point Joe uploaded a video going over many of the milestones that had been achieved along the way, ultimately showcasing how far things had come.
This is the 100th episode, 200 episodes ago, by the way, folks.
And this is our 300th episode.
And then since then, not much has changed really, besides the notoriety of the guests and the production value. The Joe Rogan Experience continues to churn out episodes with many people who all think a little bit differently, which has kept the show extremely fresh over time. Some of the most notable guests to date are individuals such as Elon Musk, Dr. Phil, Jordan Peterson, Steve-O. I mean, the list really just goes on and on. More recently, Joe Rogan announced that he would be moving the podcast to Spotify, a deal worth an estimated $100 million.
I have an announcement. The podcast is moving to Spotify.
From September 2020, the Joe Rogan Experience will be exclusive to Spotify. The show will continue to be posted in full on YouTube until December 2020, however afterwards will be discontinued from the platform. The clips will still be posted on YouTube, however for the full show you'll need to be on Spotify from December 2020.
Spotify came along and they said, we'll give you a licensing deal. So just put it on our network for 3 months, but you still own it.
Right.
I'm like, all right, we're in.
Joe also announced in July 2020 that he was planning on leaving LA to move to Texas.
Eventually, I'm going to move out of California.
How dare you?
Yeah.
When you're older?
No, not that much time. I think pretty soon.
Joe completed the move in August 2020 with pictures of the new Joe Rogan studio being posted on his Instagram. From a construction worker, to a comedian, to a Taekwondo champion, to an actor, to a UFC commentator, to a reality show host, to the most powerful interviewer of all time as stated by Jordan Peterson. Joe Rogan is a living and breathing example proving that you can do whatever you want if you put your mind to it.
Joe goes down there 5 days a week. He does 4 podcasts a week. He works out 5 days a week. He writes. On the weekend, he's always got something with his girls, you know. It's a non-stop world for Joe. What Joe does in one day, you guys do in 1 week.
A man with a set of skills so unique that he really couldn't be replaced by anyone. What Joe Rogan has accomplished is truly inspiring to many.
I've experienced a great benefit from this podcast. Yeah. I know other people benefit from it, but I've experienced a great benefit in that I've been exposed to a lot of different points of view, different personalities, different intellects, and different brilliant human beings.